Welcome to the second episode of the second season of Iran Uncovered. I'm your co-host, Cameron Khansarinia, Policy Director of NUFDI here in Washington, with my friend and co-host, Dr. Saeed Ghasseminejad in New York. Saeed, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good. Good to see you again, and even better to be with our friend and colleague and our guest today, Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. He's long worked on non-proliferation, arms control, the IRGC, the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. Now, for his expertise and, of course, his debonair tie selection, which he's deprived us of today, Behnam is often called upon by governments, including the U.S. Congress and the Canadian Parliament, and by international journalists at the Washington Post, the AB, Agence France-Presse, and many more. And you can read his excellent insight and thoughtful analysis in both foreign policy and foreign affairs. Now, he learned all of this studying international relations at the University of Chicago and international relations and Middle Eastern studies at GW. In addition to all of this, as I said, Behnam is a fine analyst, but an even finer friend. And Behnam, Saeed and I are very happy to have you today. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with you both, and especially great to be with NUFDI.
Yeah, we're excited to have you, and glad that you're joining us. Now, Behnam, I want to jump right into this, and we're going to get to a lot of the policy stuff and things that you and Saeed and I talk about pretty frequently. But before that, if I can just ask, you were, like me, born here in the States. But you're obviously of Iranian heritage. How did you get into this line of work? I mean, how did you go into the field of Iran analysis and Iran study? What was that decision like? I mean, is that something that was important to you growing up, or how did you fall into this world?
You also need to explain your middle name, because Behnam and I were colleagues for many years. And I thought he was from Khuzestan, of Arab tribes of Khuzestan. So because his middle name is Ben.
It's an excellent question. The second one is easier to explain than the first. Ben is my legal middle name. Sometimes I used to go by it when I was younger, but technically it doesn't, have the function of son of, which is, bin in Arabic or Ben in Hebrew. My parents just wanted a short English sounding middle name. And because my handwriting was and remains bad, and because some people then couldn't and still can't pronounce Behnam, they would call me by my middle name. But it's I like to have it there in like a full name, first name, middle name, last name. And some people think it's part of the last name, but no, it's just it's my middle name, and I like to have it out there.
I thought it was either that, or your parents wanted to give you an easy Ben to go by if you didn't want to go by Behnam.
Well, that's probably part of it, but it is my legal middle name.
Okay. Now, so tell us, you have the name, we've solved that issue. How and why did you get into this Iran space?
Well, kind of like what you mentioned about yourself. I grew up here in the States, both to two Iranian immigrant parents. And also kind of enmeshed in, the social and the familial structure, seeing what they spoke about Iran, how they spoke about Iran, the Iran that they remember, the Iran that they would conjure up in their stories, the Iran you would hear about in different mehmoonies or dinner parties, and the Iran that you would see cast up on television, the Iran ruled by the clerics today, the Iran that was always in the news, the Iran that was doing something against human rights, or the Iran that was doing something in the region, or the Iran that was involved in terrorism, or the Iran that, really in the 2000s to present is kind of synonymous with the nuclear quest, or was synonymous with trying to get a nuclear bomb. So I've always been someone of a historical bent, maybe some, not all of the literature behind reflects that. I always thought I'd be, working in some kind of archaeological field, but as I grew up and the Iran issues also grew in intensity, I wanted to do something with that historical knowledge to bring it to bear for, the public good, or to bring it into the present. And so I think, ultimately, my work as a think tanker here in Washington, it's a nonprofit job, but I like to think of it as something of a smaller public service, because you're taking part of a larger public debate. And let's just hope that we can all be abreast of that history as we take part of that larger debate. So it's a personal passion, but I have the luxury of making that personal passion a professional quest.
And you've certainly done a great job of it. And I want to just hop right in here. There's a piece that you all, and I want to kick this off to Saeed because he was your co-author talking about the events that we see in Iran, and the unfortunate consequences. One of many of clerical rule is something that we're on the 2-year anniversary of, coming up here in a week or two, which are the Aban protests and the ensuing massacre. And you and Saeed and another one of your colleagues wrote about that. Saeed, maybe good to hop into that.
Yeah. So yeah, we are close to the anniversary of the Aban protest, also known as the Bloody November. You, I, and Eliora Katz, we wrote a piece about the November protest, its meaning, its importance, its consequences. And when the protest happened, many Western analysts who are friendly to the regime tried to portray it as just a protest against the increase in gas price. We, on the other hand, we believed at the time, we wrote it later down, that we believed it to be a transformative moment in a transformative trend that had started 2 years ago, 2 years before the protest. So explain it, make the case for our claim.
Well, yeah, you are as unlike Kamran and I, you actually grew up in Iran. You actually got to partake in political events, protest movements. You're more intricately familiar with the various iterations of protests in the 90s and earlier 2000s and the student movement and the failure of the reform movement than both of us by virtue of your lived experience. But I think the paper that you mentioned, which we three, me, you, and Eliora co-authored, and whose anniversary that was triggered by the Aban protests we're about to come up on, is exactly a good example of doing what I was just saying, which is try to situate a present headline with historical context. If you look at a lot of these issues in Iran today, like just a screenshot, and you put it into Microsoft Paint, and you look at this issue, you only see the breadth of the issue. You don't see the depth of the issue. What we did in that paper is situated within the larger historical context of different society versus state protests. And what we saw is really an evolution in the way that street protests had developed inside Iran. We had a bunch of different measures: geography, demography, even slogans. Violence even is an interesting measure, both the willingness of the public as well as, of course, the greater willingness of the regime to bring weapons of war against their own population to check these protests. And there had been an evolution in this. And really, we draw a sharp line after 2009, looking at the 1999 and 2009 protests as being triggered by political events: the closure of a reformist newspaper, a stolen election that featured a reformist candidate. And we look at the evolution of those protests starting in 2017, also controlling for the rise of things like nationalism, also controlling for things like urban versus rural divides. And we basically see that these later iterations of protests, regardless of what their trigger is, a political trigger, an economic trigger, or social trigger, an environmental trigger, like some of the protests that we saw earlier this summer, they're sustained by a political grievance. And that political grievance is not the quest for reform. It's actually pushing past reform. It's openly seeking revolution, rather than abiding by the very narrow confines of Iranian domestic politics today, as defined by the Islamic Republic. People, by virtue of where they would go, what they would do, what they would say, and what they would chant, are actively seeking revolution. And so it's society, in a way, grabbing these taboo issues grabbing them on the third rail with two hands. And so in short, it means that if you look at the protests from 2017 to present, those are protests in favor of revolution and not reform. And we posit that, and we even had a test case at the end, we posit that if the Iranian public chose to further disavow those former institutions of reform, parliamentary elections, presidential elections, and you see with the most recent super low historic turnouts in 2020 and 2021, that this is more proof of them staying on the side of revolution rather than being put back towards reform.
Yeah, and we wrote it in early 2020. I think got published in summer of 2020, and we were quite. I was quite worried, at least, about our prediction. We discussed whether to put it or no. but I'm happy that it turned out to be true, because in 2021 we predicted that there will be boycott of presidential election, and it happened. So I'm quite happy about the results of that. Another thing that we have, we looked at the slogans, and one thing that's not being discussed a lot about in the West is this rise of slogans in defense of the Pahlavi family, which is something that really people in Washington, they don't like to talk about it. So as a Washington insider, why do you think that's the case?
I'm definitely no Washington insider, no matter how much time I've spent here. I don't know if that's more my failure or the success of others, but I'm certainly no Washington insider. But I can do my best to guess or postulate an answer, which is that, as you know, and as everyone knows, there's something of an allergy still in the foreign policy community, particularly in the mainstream foreign policy community, to the Pahlavi last name. This is something of a nonpartisan allergy. It's my assessment. I have no real empirical evidence to back this up, but it's just something anecdotally I've experienced over the years, that whether you fall on the left side of the spectrum or the right side, or you're more internationalist or isolationist, many, though not all, many in the foreign policy community still see the events of post-1979 as somehow based on events pre-1979. They have a familiar reading of things like 1953, for instance, and like many other places where the US may or may not have intervened, they see the forces that the US previously supported as somehow forever being illegitimate, coupled with, of course, a healthy distaste within the American psyche for institutions like monarchy. It creates a very kind of toxic combination. And this toxic combination, actually, if you want to be an objective analyst, is unhelpful, because it doesn't matter, former administration officials meeting with other opposition groups. What matters is what names, what persons, what entities are the people inside Iran chanting. We can't postulate who would be the best, or one of the best representatives for a future, Iranian opposition one day, without knowing what the Iranians inside Iran are actively saying about those persons. And so I think there's been a willingness to put blinders on to some of the slogans that have been chanted about the Pahlavi dynasty, really from 2017-18 to present. The Reza Shah, Ruhit Shah one, the Reza Shah, God bless your soul, slogan is understood a little bit better than the ones in favor of the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who lives in the United States. But it's just my assessment that that kind of healthy distaste in the U.S. for the monarchic institution, a shared reading of Cold War U.S. history of interventionism, coupled with a few other factors, create this allergy towards that last name. And as you know better than I, Saeed, this allergy transfers outside of Iran to institutions like the monarchy in neighboring Afghanistan and the U.S. missteps there in 2001, 2002, with trying to form a post-Taliban government.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the distaste for the monarchy, because if you look at the region, like MENA region, so you have these monarchies who are working better for the people in general, on average, if you look at the numbers. And even more important than that, for the US, all of these monarchies are US allies. US worst enemies in the region, they are all republic. But every time there is a chance, you have the US foreign policy establishment, security establishment, they are trying to get rid of its monarchies. Quite strange. It's very difficult for me to understand that. And it has really harmed the US national interest, I think.
What do you think, Kamran? Do you think, I don't see the US as like actively trying to get rid of the monarchies, but I see the sentiment where it has a different approach. I want to hear what Kamran has to say, because I want to make something of general.
I have to contradict. I think there are some institutional elements in what we see, for example, the distaste that many have in the US for the Saudis. So there is it's not a government policy, but it definitely comes from whatever you want to call, from the deep state or institutions, a push for getting rid of the crown prince there for many reasons. I think part of it is that many of them really don't like monarchies.
It could be that. The only caveat I would have to your helpful caveat is if you're controlling for that group that doesn't like an activist Arab leaders of the Persian Gulf policy, you know, like Saudi Arabia post 2012 and definitely Saudi Arabia post 2015, they still like the monarchies in Morocco and Jordan. And so squaring the circle on that is, you know, GCC versus non-GCC monarchy. But point taken.
Yeah, as it relates to Iran, you know, I think that and Afghanistan, I think that interestingly, you know, you Saeed, you've talked about this before, and just to give a bit of color to what happened in Afghanistan for those who aren't aware, when the U.S. Overthrew the Taliban and came into Afghanistan, the lawyer Jirga, which was put together, which is sort of, you know, a parliament, if you will, you know, the tribal elders, there was a straw poll done that 70%, it was said, wanted the return of Zahir Shah, who was for also about 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, at least several decades, had been in exile in Rome, similar to a situation we have now for the Iranian monarchy. And they looked, I think, Afghanistan in many ways similar to Iran, different tribal backgrounds, different toyefe, as we would say in Persian, you know, ethnic backgrounds. Many of them looked to the person or the institution of the monarch or the monarchy as a stabilizing factor that could unite all of these forces. So I think probably some of the reservation that we see in the U.S. foreign policy establishment comes from supporting a reinstallation of a monarchy. So to Behnam's point, it appears to me, in the American foreign policy establishment don't have a problem with, as he said, the Jordanian monarchy or the Moroccan monarchy. It's when it comes to a reinstallation, of course, at the choice of the people of that country, of a monarchy, that it seems to come into question, because what happened then, per the reports of the time, Zalmay Khalilzad and others interfered to prevent the assumption or the reassumption of the throne by Zahir Shah, and they pushed forward their guy, who was Hamid Karzai. So I think that a lot of Iranians, at least that I talk to, Iranian Americans, worry about something similar happening in the future. And I think that if we look at where Afghanistan is today, you know, hindsight's 2020, and we can never say what would have happened or what wouldn't have happened with any degree of certainty had Zahir Shah reassumed the throne. But I think there's a case to be made, certainly, that there would have been at least one institution that all Afghans, or at least many Afghans, could have looked to as a stabilizing, unifying force, and one that was less subject to the just overwhelming corruption that we saw throughout the Afghan state. You know, even the military, which in other Middle Eastern countries, let's say Egypt, is often looked to as a force, you know, above politics or above corruption. I mean, in Afghanistan, unfortunately, you had everything from the elected civilian government to the military, the civil service, many of the NGOs. They were all subject to just, you know, unimaginable corruption. So there's certainly a case to be made for that. But I think that the allergy exists, and it's, you know, it's not really surprising. America is a country born out of an anti-monarchical revolution, so it's not all that surprising. Although I will say, there's a fascinating book. This is very off topic, I apologize, by a professor of mine in undergrad that he recently wrote.
Is this a royalist revolution?
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly.
I recommend it for everyone who wants a countercultural take.
So you're our guest, but I've been talking too much. Tell us a bit,
No,
just as
he was your professor. You should. A friend of mine who I did debate with in DC a long time ago, and we became friends. And he's in the Foreign Service. introduced me to this book a few years back. But he was your professor. I would love to know from you. I've only read the thing.
Well, just the Spark Notes version. You tell me, because you've probably got further along in the book than I have, to be honest. It posits that the sort of conventional wisdom of the American Revolution was that it was a bunch of American patriots who wanted to overthrow the monarchy and King George. What this book posits is that actually, at least at the beginning of the American Revolution, it was, as the book title indicates, a royalist revolution, and they were using their rights as British subjects to beseech the king, the monarch, to interject and to defend their rights as British citizens against what they viewed as an overactive parliament. And so their view at the time was that it was really the parliament that was imposing these unfair taxes on them, and that as subjects of King George, they were beseeching their monarch to fulfill one of his obligations, which is to defend the rights of his citizens. So it's a really interesting take on what happened. And, certainly he has, is a very thoughtful fellow and has lots to back it up. So, but still, even aside from that, what actually happened in the conventional American wisdom, our revolution was one that overthrew a tyrannical monarch. And so it's I think difficult for a lot of Americans to even conceive that what positive role a monarchy could play in a country like Afghanistan or potentially Iran. Just one last thing I'll say, though, this is of course in conflict with the American obsession with, William and Kate, let's say, or seemingly anything that happens with the British royal family. So it's almost like, it's okay for me, but not for the type of situation, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the William and Kate situation, but, or any other pop culture tracking of the royals. But I think that the key word in what you were saying was parliament. That one of the pieces of the book is that the people were revolting against the tyrannies of parliament, if you will. The parliamentary excesses, the Window Act, the Stamp Act, the whatever acts. That the multiple instances of taxation that the people were protesting against. Yes, they wanted to create a drastically different kind of political entity, but it does draw a sharper cleavage between those British institutions of monarchy and parliament than mainstream American history textbooks do provide. And this, again, not to ironically go back to my introduction, but this is where having a history of situating, a ability to situate the present moment in larger history matters. America and America's founding story cannot be fully understood unless you understand English history, British history, the Glorious Revolution, the English Civil War, literature like, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. How did some of the British monarchy become Germanic? Statesmen inside the UK like William Pitt, for instance. It's a fascinating tangent to go down, but the lesson here is, before we draw an analytical or a policy conclusion, let's situate the present moment in the proper historical context, because nothing, whether religion, politics, language, culture, nothing on this earth is born out of a social vacuum. Nothing on this earth is born out of any kind of vacuum.
Well, then let it not be forgotten that there are many people who wanted to call George Washington His Majesty, and he refused to allow it. But getting back onto our topic of the Middle East and Iran more specifically, the phrase you use of setting current events in their proper historical context is I think something often ignored or forgotten when it comes to the Middle East or Iran more broadly, whether it's 100 years ago and the British drawing a bunch of lines throughout the Middle East and creating these countries, to policy decisions that are made today, or claims about policy that are made today. And on the cusp of the conversation about your paper, which the Iranian people have very clearly moved from a point of discussing reform to much more clearly discussing revolution, I think to the three of us, it's clear that policy conversation hasn't quite caught up in Washington, D.C. There are still many more people talking about reform in DC than there are in any part of Iran, obviously. But the conversation has changed, from 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. You do see, I think, people more openly talking about whether it's active regime change or simply the fact that, hey, whether we do anything or not, this regime may not exist down the road, and as a matter of policy.
Yeah, I want to give credit here to Behnam, in the middle of your talking. So Behnam was actually, I think, the first person who invented the phrase maximum care and maximum support. I heard maximum care for the first time from Behnam. And Cameron and I wrote a piece on why regime change or revolution is actually good for the United States, revolution in Iran, why it serves the US national interest. And it doesn't seem that it will go anywhere in the Biden administration as long as the US is concerned. But there is a chance if Biden is a long-term president, you have a return of Republican administration, we will have a change in policy. And what do you think should that policy be for the US? And how you can, what's a good policy, both in terms of goal and in terms of tactic and implementation?
So you're saying what's the ideal US-Iran policy post-2024 if there is a change in party at the White House? That's the condition.
Yeah, I think right now the Republican administration is more likely to have a change of policy. Not that we are partisan here, but
no, but so it's the change is Biden becomes one term and
let's say next US president comes to Mr. Ben Taleblu, and says, what should they do?
I'd say, who else have you talked to first? No, so before we begin on this, and Cameron, by virtue of this being a podcast, I'm gonna not ramble, but I'm gonna go long a little bit. So stop me if it is too long.
Please do.
Both you and I have somewhere to be today, but there are also concerns that what Saeed said, the framing of what Saeed said may not happen. And again, I swear I'm not trying to bring the introduction back into this, but the history into the present needs to be situated within the history. There are also more isolationist, movements within the American right. This is not a partisan statement; it's an objective statement. And those, at least on the right and on the left, seem to be the more ascendant wings. So it's also entirely possible that by virtue of where the Republican Party may be in 2024, this discussion about a more holistic Iran policy is dampened. That's caveat number one. Caveat number two is the behavior of the Islamic Republic itself. Former Secretary Mattis used to say, or like to say, the adversary gets a vote or the enemy gets a vote. Well, Iran's behavior is basically its vote here. And so what if in the interceding 3-ish years before 2024, or before, hypothetically, in this scenario, a Republican administration comes in January 2025, what if Iran actually does get the bomb by that time? Whether through the failure of nuclear diplomacy, or whether through the perception of sanctions relief, or whether through the perception that the US doesn't have the back of its traditional partners in the region, and those traditional partners don't feel comfortable with any kind of military pressure against the Islamic Republic, and US posture and US partner posture becomes more accommodationist than adversarial towards a nuclear Iran. In that scenario, it's also possible that a Republican president in 2025 scales back the already scaled back Iran policy and does a very, very, very containment light kind of approach. It wouldn't transform into a Pakistan type of scenario, because Pakistan's military, Pakistan's leaders have made, even though many in Pakistan do continue to support designated terror groups, they have played the political game very differently. Where I don't think that would be Khamenei's political game, and I don't think that would be the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' political game. I think, with the bomb, they would act worse, not differently. They wouldn't even moderate their rhetoric, let alone moderating their behavior. So the fear then is that the US could become defeatist, regardless of the political party at the helm. And if the Pakistan model is not one, then the North Korea one may be one, where I think recently the Biden administration criticized the UN on sanctions regime implementation, whereas actually the Biden administration is really, I think, missing in action on North Korean nuclear policy at the moment. And that seems to be because they're deterred by all the failures of dealing with a nuclear capable and then a nuclear possessing North Korea, whether that's the collapse of the agreed framework or things like North Korea testing ICBMs, the fire and fury situation that exists with Donald Trump, or afterwards the high-level summit diplomacy and the North Korea testing shorter range and increasingly longer range systems again. They're taken aback by the whole slew of failures. And so there seems to be a more minimalist approach. So it's entirely possible that you have a more minimalist approach. So that could be driven by situation A, different ideology within the Republican Party about foreign policy. Situation B, Iran actually getting the nuke and that eliciting a change in American foreign policy. But what I would do is actually recommend a hybrid version, or I would recommend a hybrid strategy that the US had towards the Soviet Union, something between containment and rollback. You need to situate a rollback policy of the Islamic Republic in the heartland of the Middle East, but you need to do that in a way that is sustainable, financially sustainable, politically sustainable, and secure. And also you don't end up empowering people that are could be worse or equally as bad as the Islamic Republic. So that is something to keep in mind. But the policy I would recommend is something between containment and rollback. It would be a little bit more vigorous in the region with respect to the military posture. The secret sauce, I think, towards pushing back on the Islamic Republic before we get to things like support for the Iranian people internally. The secret sauce is actually that gray zone competition. It's not just talking about the threat. It's not, you have to make every decision as a do you go to war or not threat. It's actually how do you compete in the middle. And that is everything from sanctions, cyber, sabotage, democracy promotion, graduated kinetic escalation, depending on the theater, depending on the actor. So for instance, the Biden administration just recently did sanctions against the Islamic Republic's drone industry. This seems to be the US response to a drone attack on one of its garrisons in southeastern Syria. That is a de minimis approach that I think good gray zone competition would take, because if you don't end up deterring Iran in the gray zone, if you don't end up contesting Iran in the gray zone, if you don't end up trying to push back on Iran in the region, then you end up sending the worst signals on other things. So that it means that on the nuclear file, it can do whatever it wants to do. And at home, it has a freer hand and more resources to do whatever it wants to do. And basically, the unfortunate paradigm you see with the Islamic Republic is aggression abroad and repression at home. Those things tend to go hand in hand. And in this sense, Washington, if we're going to, politely hit the foreign policy elite here, did not pay attention to, I think, a gem former Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif gave in his, leaked audio recording, his multiple hours of Q&A that was leaked earlier in the spring of 2021. And in that, there was a line that was very well translated and made the rounds, but people didn't, again, internalize that and situate that within what's going on. Zarif said he was complaining about the Revolutionary Guard Corps, that Iran has, or that the regime has sacrificed diplomacy at the altar of the Maidan, at the altar of the battlefield. And so this, people read this really within the factional prism, Zarif versus the IRGC, Rouhani versus the IRGC, clerics versus the IRGC, moderates versus hardliners, that kind of prism. But actually, this needs to be looked at through the foreign policy and strategic competition lens, meaning if you have an adversary where even people inside the regime are admitting that the adversary is putting all its eggs in this one basket, the Maidan, the region, the battlefield. If you are opposing that adversary, a la another military theorist up here, you concentrate your forces at that center of gravity. You should actually be doing everything you can against that adversary in this place, in the Maidan. If you want to have a counter-Islamic Republic policy, it begins in the region. A future administration, Republican or Democrat, that has a tough policy on Iran, perhaps just super beefed up sanctions, but is missing an action in the region, will end up replicating the failures of the past. And this is a de minimis approach, I think, for a Republican president in 2024. Another is, don't miss an opportunity. Opportunities presented to you by potentially more protests on the street in Iran, potentially.
I just want to say something about your last point, and this is something that the Trump administration really didn't do, except maybe in the case of Soleimani. That was the big one. But beyond that, they really didn't push back. So I think that was one of their biggest mistake.
Yeah, I think with people read the years of maximum pressure wrongly. I totally agree, and I'm bless you both for the footnote on maximum care or maximum support. As much as we all agreed with in principle the maximum pressure policy, we were all able to identify, perhaps we all didn't use the same words, maximum care or maximum support, but we were all able to identify that, hey, those 12 points don't have a domestic Iranian component, don't have a human rights component, don't have a democracy promotion component, are totally divorced from the historical context of, as long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there have been massive protests against that Islamic Republic. And that is not featured really into the logic of the 12-point policy that was supposed to be the aims of maximum pressure. But to your point about the administration not having a foreign and security policy, I think it did comparatively better than that which it received. But, also the bar for a response was rather high. So, Trump's red line in places like Iraq was rather clear. That's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that you don't get dragged into needless conflicts, but it's bad in the sense that if you have a very high red line, and Trump's red line was the killing of an American, the loss of life, you basically give a green light to the proxies to do everything just short of that red line. And some of the work I did in 2020 was detailing and giving sourcing to every single rocket, mortar, and drone attack by Shia militia groups in Iraq against the constellation of U.S. facilities or sites associated with the U.S. force presence in Iraq.
And sorry to interrupt, Behnam, but not only that, but just to your point of the red line, if the red line is so high, if the bar is so high for American involvement or an American response, isn't it the case that let's say the example of Iraq, where it was the killing of American soldiers, the loss of American life, if it's that high, and you allow the regime, as you say, to do everything up until that line and just inch right up to it, you allow the proxies, as I think we saw in Iraq, to gain such a foothold and take effectively control of that country, such that if and when they decide to cross that red line, they are at such an emboldened and empowered state that now the cost to America of enforcing that red line is now much higher, because it's not just responding to something, it's you're responding to a significantly empowered enemy. Isn't that right?
For sure. There's a former colleague, Saeed, and I have, whose name we won't mention, but routinely I would say to him, and he would agree, that, again, regardless of party, America needs an Iraq policy, and it needs an Iraq policy that is more than just two things, because I am unable under Trump and under Obama, and definitely under Biden, to discern an Iraq policy that is more than just a counter-ISIS policy or a counter-Iran policy. If you're going to win in the Maidan, you need a policy for each Maidan. You need a Yemen policy. You need a Syria policy. You need a Lebanon policy. You even need a Bahrain policy. You need these policies. And they are either appropriated to under the counterterrorism rubric, or which is increasingly being pushed away, given the interest in great power competition. And I do agree that states are the main threats, but it doesn't mean that you need to have an all or nothing approach. And B, if it is the state approach, which is, it's again, the inverse of the all or nothing, they go all in and they only see these individual countries through the Iran prism, and that can be detrimental to you in the medium or long term.
So one thing, and this is sort of where I was going before we got into this, which I'm glad we did, because that was very helpful, is when we as Americans, or when policymakers, as Saeed said, DC insiders like yourself, Behnam, although you would never make this mistake.
Also not an insider.
People of the deep state like you, when we look at policy, especially when it comes to Iran, as you gave one example, which is we look at the Islamic Republic denying the context of 42 years of popular protest against the regime, especially clear in the last 5 years, as you all outlined in your piece. One of the other ways it appears to me that we do it, and something that concerns me a lot, and I know concerns a lot of people inside Iran and Iranian Americans here, is that the U.S. may make another mistake policy-wise, and that is if the argument that you all make in your piece, becomes more accepted that Iran is in a pre-revolutionary state, possibly revolutionary state, the argument that Saeed and I made in our piece that such a change would be beneficial to the United States. Naturally, some policymakers start to think about, okay, how can we do that? And we'll get back to you on what your ideal solution would be. Certainly, I have my views, and I think obviously Saeed does as well. But one thing that I sort of hear a few more whispers of, sometimes whispers, sometimes people just come out and say it, is talking about what we would refer to as ethnic separatism or secessionism in Iran. You saw some of this in Iraq, but just to give a 30-second blip on what this is for our listeners who aren't familiar, Iran is a very diverse country, obviously, and it has a unifying language of Persian, and many people know it for the Persian language. But for thousands of years under the Persian Empire, there were different tribes like the Lors and Bakhtiaris. We have different ethnic groups, be they Azeris or Kurds or Iranian Arabs.
I just want to correct something. It
Please.
hasn't been Persian Empire for like a long time. Like it has been Persian Empire at the beginning, then you have the Parthian, and then you have the Sasanian, or what it's called, Sassanid, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And at that time, definitely, you had it as Iran, like you had it as Iran Shah. So, so this Persian thing, it's something that comes from Westerners.
Yeah,
so
from Alexander the Great.
Yeah, they know us as Persian.
Right. Yeah.
It has been Iran for a long time. So
yeah, no, you're exactly right. And that's sort of the point I'm making, which is in the Western convention, it's the Persian Empire. And for Iranians, however, in domestic or internal Iranian affairs, Iran has always been the name, and it has always been a very diverse nation state. Iran Shah, you use the Persian name, but broader Iran, and it's always been not just people of the Persian language or Persian ethnicity, but a very diverse set of people, which are colloquially and collectively in the West referred to as Persians or the Persian Empire, which is not true, but that's the convention. But to the policy, I think some people look at that, Behnam, and tell me if I'm wrong, look at that and say, okay, if we want to weaken the regime, let's in some way try to empower or promote these groups who some of them may want to break away from Iran, like going back to this secessionist or separatism. I think Iranians are by and large opposed to that. Can you just describe how you see this? I mean, what is, talk about it from an Iranian perspective inside the country, and then we'll get to it from a U.S. policy perspective and what you think, whether it's good or bad. But can you just give us your...
Before Behnam gives it to us, because I have been born and raised in Iran. And so sometimes people call me like Persian fascist or something like that. So I was born in Mazandaran. My parents were born and raised in Mazandaran. Like my whole family had been living there for a long time. So as long as we can trace it back. And it's very interesting to me that because I say I'm against separatism in Iran, they assume that I'm a Persian, which I don't know what it is exactly, because Persian seems to be whatever it's not the other ethnic minorities that they identify. or people whose mother tongue is Persian. So difficult to define it, but I'm not that, whatever that is, I'm not that. And I have spent most of my childhood during the summer in Mazandaran, not even in the city, in the countryside. And many of the things that these like experts or these separatist elites are saying, I haven't seen that. It's not that I lived all my life in Tehran and I didn't see that. Again, I'm coming from that family background, spent time there. Actually, I lived outside Tehran for a long time before going to Tehran. And many of the things that they are saying, it's not just true, like in my lived experience, it's not true. And another thing from my family background, so we are what you can call pure Mazandarani until this generation, until last generation.
You messed up the trend. You went to Tehran.
Yeah, and my 3 aunts, they are married to my now uncles, 3 Turk coming from other family or Turk or whatever you want to call it. So Iran is not like, you know, this like people separated by their ethnic origin. It's a very mixed one. Of course, when you go to like, you know, you go to countryside, like in Azerbaijan or in Mazandaran, you have like what they call it, like the pure ethnic purity, but it's very mixed, and it becomes more, it has become more and more mixed as you have like the rate of urban population has gone up. So cities are generally where you have like this mixation. So the pictures that many of these, again, separatist elites or some of these experts are giving, it's really, I think it doesn't reflect the reality of Iran.
And that's how I want to pose it to you, Behnam, is because I think, tell me if I'm wrong, this fits in with your theme of some Western policymakers who may support some secessionist movements like this are trying to solve what they view as their short-term problem, but they're doing so in a way that, at least to me, and based on what Saeed said to Saeed, lacks the broader historical context. What do you think?
Yeah, so that seems to be part of the case, but let me just zoom out, 5,000%. I realize, because we did have many tangents, I'm going to invite myself to another NUFDI podcast to do the, what should future U.S. policy be for Iran, domestically.
Yes.
We actually didn't get to talk about, we talked about the maximum pressure abroad. We talked very detail about the theaters, but not in detail about the domestic component. So let's put a pin in that conversation.
We'll come back. We'll have you back.
We can return to that because that is a very rich discussion, but I know that this is our actual main topic today. Listen, I want to begin with that history, and I think Saeed's picking apart of that language is very key, because this is actually where the whole house falls apart. You look at the country that we call Iran today. The government name is the Islamic Republic of Iran, but that entity, that geographic entity, we know that the boundaries of it, Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, Iraq, Afghanistan, we know that entity as Iran. That entity on paper, on the map today, is smaller, actually, than it has been. So when you talk about, for instance, I think you made the joke in the earlier part of your intro about the British or different Western powers drawing, arbitrary lines. Those lines, and by virtue of several Iranian successive defeats in the past few centuries, are what account for the smaller, not larger scale and scope of the entity that we call Iran today. The next is the Persian label that Saeed rightly took umbrage with. Persian was often something not exclusively abroad, but mostly something that people looking from the outside in. Yes, there were people from within who would use the term Persian. But mostly it was an outside-in term, and it's really a response to the Achaemenid dynasty, 535. It's like the first major dynasty. It's often treated as the first, Persian empire, but also it's part and parcel of this larger Iranian monarchic tradition. Until then, you had the Medes in northwest Iran, and even before then, you had a lot of other different political entities, empires, you could call them the Elamites, for instance, and they were actually Semitic, we believe. The Medes and the Persians were Indo-European, and thus you have from the 700s BC up until present the Indo-European ascendancy. But that ascendancy is actually challenged because when you try to apply the term Persian in an ethnic sense to most Iranian successive empires, you can't really do that after the Arab invasion of Iran. You have definitely major different Iranian secessionist, anti-Arab revolts happening. In fact, that's how part of the Abbasid dynasty got started. But you had the Umayyads, the Abbasids, basically Arabo-Islamic centric. You had several other in Central Asia and South Asia breakaway kingdoms and empires. You had many fractious periods. But basically, for about 900 years, up until the Pahlavi dynasty, you have a Turco-Mongolian kind of ascendancy, but most Iranian leaders were actually Turkic. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, which I have an English copy of up here, was written, he's talking about Basi ranj bordam dar in sadasi, ajab zinde kardam. Everyone knows that poem about resurrecting the Persian language, but actually it was ended up being a gift to a Turkic sultan. Yeah. The Ghaznavid Empire, located in larger Khorasan then modern day Afghanistan today. There is a Persianate world. The term Persianate you can use to apply to architecture in India, architecture in Uzbekistan. There is the term Iranian or Iranic you could use to apply to traditions like Nowruz that you can find among the Kurdish people. Kurdish is actually an Indo-European language. There are many, 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 many ways to unpack this. And I think the hyper-focus on this Persian one is pejorative, it is political, and it is divorced from this larger understanding. And the big thesis of this larger understanding is that whatever ethnic background these leaders were in, were leaders of that entity that we called Iran, they were cognizant that the polity that they ruled over was, to borrow a phrase from this Chicago professor up here who talked about the dynasty Saeed mentioned, the Sassanid dynasty, the last major dynasty before the Arab invasion of Iran, was a state of mixture. He's talking about Christianity in Sassanid Iran, but nonetheless, these Iranian leaders knew that their state was a state of mixture. And it's about balancing these things. And in the modern era where you get the development of the nation states have what we call a national culture. America has a national culture. Israel has a national culture. India has a national culture. Japan has a national culture. Hungary has a national culture. These national cultures, particularly even in the US today, are vigorously debated by its component parts. But nonetheless, there is a contest over what best defines that national culture. And I think when we're moving into this discussion, and I promise this is the last historical thing I want to say, is we should be cognizant of all those component parts that may not ethnically be reflective of that national culture, but socially and civically and politically are. You look at the history of the Constitutional Revolution, many of the outsized thinkers came from the two Iranian provinces of Azerbaijan. One of the most interesting histories of the Azeri language comes from Saeed Ahmad Khasravi Tabrizi. These things are not alien to Iran's national history, are not alien to understanding Iranians or Persians, as some would like to say. They are part and parcel of it. One of the most amazing, interesting things to reflect and respect the mixture that existed is to remember that there are many, many, many minorities in the Middle East today are under pressure. And most unfortunately, many of our minority, ethnic and religious minority friends are under pressure today inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. There are discriminatory policies and practices. No one is going to deny that necessarily. We can have a debate about that. But that when we look to the constitutional revolution, for instance, something to remember, and I believe his role was this, Saeed or Kamran, correct me if I get the role wrong, but after the ascendance of some of the nationalist forces, the constitutionalist forces, there was an Armenian military official, Yeprem Khan Armani, and this guy became the head of the Tehran police. Imagine a Christian and an ethnic, a religious and an ethnic minority becoming the head of the police of the capital of a Muslim Middle Eastern nation a century ago. You know, Iran has this rich diversity. When we talk about this, the Islamic Republic continues many of the centralizing themes that you see in Iran of the 20th century, which is the expanse of central authority in Iran. But other than that, it has sparked debates that are really in many ways alien to this rich legacy, this rich, diverse history. So this is the, I wanted to get this historical anecdote off my chest to right-size these debates about Persian and Iranian before we begin.
I want to add something, because so they portray Pahlavi as the initiator of the forced Persianification in Iran. And you look at the Pahlavi family, this is a family from Mazandaran.
Yep.
With input from Azerbaijan and Caucasus. So this is not a Persian family. And if you look at the leaders of the Islamic Republic, so you have Azeris who have a prominent role, Mir Hossein Mousavi himself, prime minister. Khamenei is a city in Azerbaijan, if I'm not wrong. You have people from Arab descent, you have people from Gilan, Mazandaran, Kurdistan, Bijan Zanganeh, the long-time oil minister. So it's not like that you have like these Persians who are running the country and they're oppressing everyone else. And you see this in like the describing the regime's foreign policy, which many Westerners and people in the region, especially Arab commentators, they are calling it Persian Empire. The Islamic Republic is expanding the Persian Empire, which is for the Arab governments of the region. I understand it. It's much more easier for them if they, describe it as a Persian Empire. But in reality, what you have the Shia in Lebanon, you have the Shia population in Yemen, you have the Shia population in Syria, you have the Shia population in Iraq, which are Arabs. And they're working with the regime to expand this Shia empire, not Persian empire. And for Westerners, I think it really goes back to Herodotus, because they like to call this Persian empire, and it really leads to bad policy. If you don't understand the problem, then your response to the problem would be bad in the regional context. And in the domestic context, again, as I said, you have this problem that the Islamic Republic is being described as a government ruled by Persian for Persians. That's not true. The rulers are not Persian exclusively, and they are not, pushing Persian policy.
Last thing before we get into the present policy debate, I swear this is the last historical.
No, please.
Where this is, it's just that I actually find some of this stuff more interesting. I know we're here to talk present policy, but again, with that, that childlike interest still in history in me, that is still bewildered and fascinated by this shared history, is the way that in many times in the past half millennia, from basically the Safavid Empire on down, that when there is a collapse in central authority, and this, you have to give the proto supporters of secessionism a little bit of intellectual credit here, because this is where they get this. when there is a collapse in central authority, there is a rise in peripheral authority. But this is the case everywhere. The margins become ascendant when you have a collapse in the center. You have a capital collapse, well, you're going to have breakaways. You're going to have competing interpretations of who is the legitimate heir, who is the legitimate rival, and competition within those camps. But really, looking at some of the historical correspondences by Turkic leaders, by ethnic Turkmen leaders, by Azeri-speaking and Lors as well. You have the Zand, you have, of course, the Afghan invasion of Iran. We should not forget that after the Safavid Empire that causes the decline and fall of the Safavid Empire. But you have basically like this different competition. And one of the terms that is very interesting that is used when like different princes, Zand dynasty princes, writing letters to Afsharid princes, later on Qajar princes, there is this term, Varis Mulk Kian, the inheritor. I'm just doing a rough translation. The inheritor of the royal land or the regal realm. Here's these people, these different groups. None of them match that, ethnic Persian group, but they are fighting over this shared term, the inheritor of the regal realm, the legacy of the regal realm. Here's these people, Nader Shah, by many accounts, did not even speak good Persian. But here are these people descendant from him or around him that are fighting with other ethnic minorities for this title. This is the history of this entity. This is the continuity, different ethnic minorities that have come and chosen to live in and lead Iran. This is the legacy they choose to invoke. So if you look at, the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, you may say, okay, this is some Perso-centric, Persophilia moment. But you cannot divorce different leaders in the past from coming to draw on the legacy of the empires that have come before and the rich tapestry of peoples that have lived there. Fath Ali Shah, the Qajar, second Qajar king, has these, I've never had the pleasure of driving by there, Saeed, you probably have, these rock inscriptions in mountainsides in Iran, which basically mirror, and they're like hunting scenes. They basically mirror the rock inscriptions in places like Tagh-e-Bostan in Iran, where you have Sassanid kings either having like crowning ceremonies, being divinely anointed, or also engaging in hunting scenes or warlike scenes. They're mirroring each other. They're cognizant of this history. So when we get into this context about politics, let's just be cognizant that the people who actually live in Iran, who may fall into these categories of Persian or non-Persian, are also cognizant of this history, and they are the inheritors of this legacy. So that, I think, me as an Iranian American living outside here, Saeed is someone who has moved, and many others. This is something that, first we look to and listen and learn from them. And this is the shared history. So onto present policy. Many see this ethnic issue as something that's basically a shiv, right? A vector for pressure against the Islamic Republic. If the official language of Iran is Persian, if people talk about the Persian Empire, then of course, perhaps there is opposition to that which is official. There is plenty of opposition to that which is official. The religion of Iran is 12 Shiism, the official religion. There's plenty of opposition to that. There is opposition to everything inside Iran that is a tool for pressure by the state against the people. That is a broad thing we can agree on. But beyond that, many of the fights that you have are center-periphery fights, and many of the fights that people are looking to try to put a finger on, and I don't think this is broadly Western policy, but it's a view some Western analysts hold. It's a view very, very, very select Western policymakers hold, but the fear is that it could become an ascendant view, that we don't have a proper counter-Islamic Republic of Iran policy, but hey, it looks like there are some freedom fighters here or here. It looks like the freedom fighters there. Or hey, it looks like this state is kind of like a South African kind of state. or hey, it looks like this state is not really a state, it's really an empire. And, we're in the counter-imperial business anyway. And as we're looking, as the US, this is the generic framing, as the US is looking to get out of the region, why not have its strategy and its morals come together and empower those people who could become pro-American or are pro-American by virtue of them being anti-regime? And the regime, in this case, they don't define as an Islamist autocracy. They define it as some kind of weird Persian fascist thing. And this is the framing. This is the ideology of those who would be inclined to, from abroad, support separatism.
Which just
give them their best case. This is their best case argument, that we don't have a counter-Iran policy that's proper. We believe there to be ethnic minorities. We believe the ethnic issue to be a state-centric thing that people are putting down. And we want to push back on it. And we want to push back on it cheaply and effectively and in a way that marries our strategy and our values. And in this case, they borrow from the Soviet Union. So this is their argument in bright lights.
But before you get into, I think that you're exact, before you get into why, just to point out one thing you said and Saeed said, how any policymaker could look at the leaders of the Islamic Republic, whether it's Ali Khamenei, the Guardian Council, any of these groups. I mean, 9 out of 10 clerics. Look at these people sitting around in clerical garb, clearly. People like, perhaps prefer to read the Quran in Arabic than, speak in proper Persian like Khomeini, and say these people are forcing a Persianate policy is beyond me. But in any case, back to your, I just want to point out what seems so absurd to that about me, what seems so absurd to me about that view that these people who are so clearly anti-Iranian in so many ways are described as enforcing a quote unquote fascistic Persianate or Persian focused policy. It just seems to me to be quite absurd. But sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's okay. So, but this is what I was saying was this is. Before we, criticize a view, we have to put the view in bright light. So this is their view. Now to kind of begin the criticism. One, for instance, this view of, being able to tap into or support, the breakup of Iran as a counter-Islamic Republic of Iran policy is by definition a self-defeating move. Because the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, as empirical evidence shows the past 4 decades, is not in the business of actually bolstering Iran. The government of the Islamic Republic's interest is drastically different than that of the interests of the state, the entity, the public good of what you would say is the Iranian national interest. The intervention in Syria, I forget who said this, but it was a line in 2013 about trading Khuzestan for Syria. That it's better to keep Syria and lose Khuzestan.
Yeah.
When you talk about wanting to improve the welfare of all people inside Iran, I'll never forget this line that later on, I think even he realized how bad this line was. He came to try to walk it back or say the press took it out of context, but it was Velayati's line that the Iranian people, and this is at the peak of max pressure, that the Iranian people should learn from the people of Yemen who have only a dry piece of bread and like no clothing, and they're still resisting. This is what the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran have in mind. They're not interested in the common good, the welfare, the national interest of the country, the public good of the people. They're interested in maintaining this Islamist revolutionary autocracy, and they're interested in expanding it whenever they're not maintaining it. That accounts for the adventurism abroad. It doesn't account for the way they're necessarily doing this business at home. And I
also want to add something. So if you look at like the regional policy where they go for intervention, it's in the Shia regions. Like they had the option, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, or after the civil war in Afghanistan, to really invest there. They didn't do that. Where they go is in like Syria, which has been out of the Persian Empire realm for a long time, or Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon. These are like places with Shia population. Again, like you see this, that this is not a government whose main issue is, the expansion of Persian Empire. Its main issue is the expansion of the Shia Empire in the region.
Yeah, it needs a constituency. And that, the sectarian one is the easiest constituency for them to find. It's not the only one, but it's the easiest one.
Yeah, let me tell you a funny story. So in Tajikistan, after the fall of the Soviet Union, so they came to Iranian government, the Islamist regime, and asked them, okay, we need like some books. We want to revive the Persian language there. And they sent them books, and they returned them back because all the books were apparently about Shiism. So they were, through these books, they were trying to, to turn them into Shia. And so that's really a good story about what drives them.
Yeah, I mean, Iran also didn't invest heavily in the non-Arab space for that cultural kind of diplomacy, and really one country that did and really beat Iran in that was Turkey. Turkey was able to kind of use that kind of the pan-Turkic banner, even in places where there wasn't a national constituency like Tajikistan versus the other Central Asian republics where there would be. But that was really a shortcoming, one of the many shortcomings of the Islamic Republic's diplomacy. Looking at Tajikistan and not knowing that these guys extol the Samanids and instead of the Shiism.
And it's really related to their domestic policy, because if they decide to, expand this Persian Empire, going back to lands which have been historically Iranians, like on the east and on the north, these are like the lands which for centuries, if not thousands of years, these have been inhabited by Iranian people. And if they want to go to that direction, then it's really in conflict with their ideology, which is a Shiite ideology. Because you cannot go outside and try to expand the Persian Empire, and then you go inside and say, no, this Persian Empire was not a good thing. It's very good that Islam invaded Iran, or Arabs invaded Iran, brought Islam. So that's like, that's the conflict that they have. And it's not a surprise that they are going to West, because that's where you have the Shiites. Not in the east and not in the northeast part of the country.
It's not surprising. What is though surprising about this is that this sort of goes back to the thing I said about how anyone could look at the leadership of the Islamic Republic, just at literally judge a book by its cover and say these people are having some sort of Persianate policy. When one puts it in the context of the actual policy that they have followed and where they have chosen to expand, that it's really a Shia empire they're looking to create, or more of a caliphate than an empire, than a Persian empire. What's shocking is how some in the West can draw the conclusion that the Islamic Republic has this policy, and therefore to weaken it, one must support, and I really like the phrase you use, Saeed, the separatist elite, because it's my analysis that even the ethnic minorities in Iran, and as you say, it's very important to emphasize, the issue in of itself is overblown. Nobody really knows. You have in one apartment building in Iran, Kurds and Lurs and Mazandaranis and Turks and Azeris and Arabs. Everyone's living together. It's not as if the country is divided or segregated as much in that sense. It strikes me that it is really this separatist elite that you refer to that is pushing this idea of secessionism and separatism, as opposed to the broad base of population, even amongst Iran's ethnic minority communities. But Behnam, I want to go back to you from a policy perspective, which you were getting into. I think that the first point you're making is, look, if you want to weaken this threat, then the Islamic Republic is your best bet, because it is itself focused on weakening Iran. Yes.
So if we take that framing that you need a counter Islamic Republic policy, step one of this thinking would say, okay, you need to have a break up Iran policy or a counter Iran policy, and no one is denying that is not going to cause headaches for the Islamic Republic. But we're saying that the negative, strictly, amoral, strictly that is actually going to redound to your deficit later on as a policymaker, because it will necessarily do things for you that you are looking to actively avoid, such as it may actually draw you back into a conflict. One example is, of course, if you look at the way this issue happened before with Stalin and the early part of the Cold War, there were attempts both for Azerbaijan and Iranian Kurdistan to be backed by, when Saeed's term of a separatist elite is correct, a foreign kind of communist international supported elite in both of these two areas. And ultimately, once Soviet troops withdrew, these places fell. In fact, some of the earliest cases of the UN Security Council are America siding with the governments of Iran against, getting Soviet troops after the end of World War II out of occupied territories inside Iran. And so when the Soviet Union was leaving or trying to leave, or after it left, it tried to erect these things to kind of make a Swiss cheese policy out of Iran. But ultimately, with the support of the US and ultimately the support of the local populations versus the kind of foreign supported separatist elite, these attempts to make Iran into some kind of Swiss cheese confederacy failed. And so the first kind of strike against this view of, if you're going to be anti-Islamic Republic, then you need to be anti-Iran, is to say, hey, look at some of the more recent attempts to make this kind of Swiss cheese confederacy, and they failed. And in fact, they failed because those elites did not actually have grassroots support. So this is number one. Number two is actually, and again, this is to put that argument in its best light, is to say that in the era where the Islamic Republic is actually shoving official religion down everyone's throats, people are actually turning to their ethnic identity as a way to push back on the regime's Islamist overlay of everything. This is true on the micro level by people having, less historically Arab names and more historically Persian names. This is just, small anecdotal, but also for the major non-Persian ethnic groups in Iran, Azeri, Kurd, Lor, Baluch, we can get into each one. It also means that embracing that non-Persian ethnic identity more. And in this sense, there is a credence to what some of the separatist folks are saying, in that there is this rise in ethno-nationalism in Iran because there is this greater pull, tug of war between society and the state in Iran. What the people studying, quote unquote, separatist movements don't necessarily see, and we actually all learned this from a friend of ours who spent some time doing fieldwork inside Iran, Wang Shuye, fieldwork by being detained in Evin prison, same prison Saeed was detained in, is that people are actually in Iran who have this ethnic background able to balance it with a larger background. It's not like you are only Baluch. Someone who identifies as Baluch will also identify as Iranian.
You just saw
balance multiple identities. It's like, here I can tell you I'm an Iranian American, or here I can tell you I'm a male, or and give you different viewpoints into my identity. One need not be in conflict with the other. So strike two for the separatism crew is to see the embrace of ethnic identity as necessarily being to the detriment of civic nationalism. Like, someone could be a proud Californian, but also a proud American. And that this word nationalism is used intentionally, which I'll get to in the next part, but I just cut you off.
No, you're right. Was going to say another thing that we're on the anniversary of, which is yesterday, is Cyrus the Great Day. And you saw that yesterday, specifically a few years ago, before the Islamic Republic really shut down the roads around Cyrus's tomb at Pasargad. You saw, Lors and Bakhtiaris in their traditional tribal clothing, or Azaris speaking in Azari or singing Azari songs at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, holding hands. So So they don't view their generally their ethnic identity as being in conflict with their Iranian identity. Rather, they're either one and the same, or they're complementary, or they are, you use the term Californian and American. They go hand in glove in many circumstances, and it is the Azeri next to the Lur, next to the Arab, next to the Turk, which feeds that Iranian and contributes to that Iranian heritage. And that's why I think in many ways the regime is so afraid of the legacy of Cyrus, and they block the roads around it because they don't want that to be seen.
Especially because some of these ethnic identities that exist in Iran, not all of them, some of these are part of the general Iranian people. Like, this is not like something that, we create. It's something that's widely accepted. Like the Lurs, the Kurds, the Baluch, the Gilani, the Mazandarani. These are like part of the wider Iranian people as defined by scientists. So it's not that if you are a Lur, you see yourself as non-Iranian. You probably see yourself as a, even purer Iranian. So I heard this from some of my Lur friends. So that's why they need to create this like Persian identity, or Persian oppressor identity. So they can tell like to Mazandaranis, to Lurs, to Kurds, that you are really different from them. I don't think that's true.
I would also, there is a lot of discussion to be had on this nationalism point, and let's get back to that. But Saeed mentioned a lot about, the coexistence, and you mentioned the physical shared space. Saeed mentioned the intermarrying. From a policy perspective, right, if you're ultimately doing or ultimately supporting this idea, and we've said that this idea is more likely to exist among elites rather than the masses, if you're ultimately supporting this from a policy perspective, and you want to do like a pressure policy against Iran, the Islamic Republic on the cheap, and your view is, okay, it's pressuring Iran, it's breaking up Iran. Why is this a bad idea if you're trying to do a pressure policy against Iran on the cheap? Well, because you don't learn the lessons of Kashmir, and you don't learn the lessons of Yugoslavia. Meaning, if you don't care about the Middle East and you're trying to actively impede the room for maneuver of the Islamic Republic, and you are trying to get away from the region, and you care about great power competition and the Asia-Pacific theater and containing the rise of China, you just want to have the Islamic Republic in check a little bit, and you want the Middle East to have less chaos than it does currently, because unlike other jurisdictions in the Middle East, Syria, an example, what the U.S. The threat from Syria is not necessarily jurisdiction of strong central authority, like the Assad regime is going to go take over all of the Middle East. It's jurisdiction of weak central authority, where the Assad regime is more reliant on Iran and Russia, where Syria is punctured by multiple terrorist groups, not potential, in reality, is invaded by other countries, Turkey in the north, for example. You fear the instability that comes from the lack of central authority. Given the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, policymakers rightly fear the instability that comes from central power, central authority. So their thing is, okay, you denigrate central authority. But the lesson of population transfers in Kashmir and Yugoslavia here is instrumental, because if you are trying to actively create less conflict in the Middle East as a way to cap the situation, to facilitate the pivot out of the region, why are you actively setting multiple peoples who have been able to live around each other at war with one another? The lesson of what Saeed is saying about intermarriage and what others have said about living in the shared physical space is that many of the language maps that you see today in Iran are not necessarily going to be where the people actually live. Those are the historical areas where that is spoken as the mother tongue, but it is not necessarily where only Kurds live, or only Arabs live, or only Turkic speakers or ethnic Azeris live. If you are going to, in the pure hypothetical, segregate off one portion of Iran and draw an arbitrary line and create a new state or a statelet out of anything. There would have to be a population transfer. How do you enforce that? How do you control for that? That is actively creating more chaos rather than less. If you're actively giving the Islamic Republic or whatever central authority exists there more of an opportunity for a headache. And if you, the great power, are looking to get away from conflicts, to cap conflicts, this is actually a self-defeating move. And worse than that, if your view is, okay, we want a policy towards Iran that is in concert with American strategy and American values, support for oppressed peoples, that would actively be a policy that leads to more oppression. A case in point, the collapse of Yugoslavia, that was not a clean situation. What you saw in the Balkans in the 1990s is immensely tragic. And the feeding of that ethno-national impulse would not only be counter to all that talk I had about the past 2 millennia of Iranian history, and counter to what you're talking about, the shared experience, it would be not learning from places where population transfers have gone wrong and there have been conflicts and there remain blood feuds. And that would be the worst thing for a US foreign policy that believes it is doing the right thing by its strategy to cap conflict and the right thing by its values, which is to empower people and to have people have their own representative government.
And
so
I want to add, yeah. I want to add something. It's also self-defeating in the sense, I think, that it makes the probability of regime going down less.
Exactly.
For 2 reasons. One is that, so you have this Islamist ideology in Iran, which is ruling the country. And you are right, you have an ascendance in the ethnic nationalism in Iran. But more than that, you have an ascendance in Iranian nationalism.
Exactly.
And as I said, many of these ethnicities, they are Iranians. So you have this large force, stronger in terms of force, the Iranian nationalism, larger in terms of population. So the first thing is that if you go for separatism, this force will sit at home. The other option is that some of them may back the government. It's totally possible, but a big chunk of it will sit at home. That's the first one. The second one is that the issue of civil war, as you correctly said about Yugoslavia, no one wants civil war. I think for many Iranians, a civil war, the bloodshed, is worse than the Islamic Republic. Because at least the Islamic Republic, there is some kind of order. Civil war is really horrific. And it's not something that the Iranians don't know about. It's not just Yugoslavia. They saw it in Afghanistan. You have so many Afghans who came to Iran after civil war. Now you have another wave. They saw it in Iraq. They saw it in Syria. So it's not that they don't know what happens in civil war. So if you push this, if it becomes a real option, if Iranians believe, oh, there's going to be a civil war, I don't think many of them will not push for the collapse of the regime.
Exactly. And in this sense, it becomes, again, because we should be very careful. Again, I don't at all have the lived experience of you. I talked, briefly about the comments by our friend Wang Shuye and you, because you shared the unfortunate Evin experience. But it is counter to so much of the analytical policy impulse, which is, how do you appropriately weaken the Islamic Republic? I want to make sure I'm saying this as an analyst and not an advocate, that you are, this sort of policy may end up empowering the sort of thing you want to detract from. You know, Iran-Iraq war is a great example, again, because it continues that thing from the Safavid dynasty, which is the collapse of central authority means the rise in peripheral authority. You have the collapse of the Pahlavi monarchy. You have basically a 6 to 8 month period in Iran where Khomeini and the nascent revolutionaries and the Komitachis and all these guys, the proto-Basijis, are essentially, you know, killing anyone, you know, tied to the security establishment. You have basically officer corps being killed or driven into exile or defecting, or you have basically people who don't know how to use many of the conventional capabilities that Iran has, the atrophying of Iran's conventional capabilities, the rise of multiple of these armed ethnic insurgencies, but also the invasion of a foreign power on the back of the claim of supporting, in this case, it wasn't the only claim, but it was one of the several, you know, political shields Saddam used for the 1980 invasion of Iran, you know, supporting the Arabs in Khuzestan, for instance. Not only did the historical experience prove Saddam wrong, you know, the evicting the multiple battles in Khorramshahr, Susandier, these areas where you had lots of ethnic minorities participating, but ultimately that conflict proved that the regime will use these sorts of crises to stabilize. One reason why scholars, you know, look at the 1982 to 1988 period as really an intensification period of and a coarsening and a hardening of Iran's domestic politics is that the cover of the foreign conflict allowed these guys to narrow the spectrum, allowed these guys to become the elite that are at the helm today. And it would be the worst thing in the world to afford the Islamic Republic yet another opportunity to do this, particularly when you have signs, going back to the Alban protests, that the regime is echoing worse signs that existed in the late Shah's era about, you know, shortages, strikes, hyperinflation, center periphery issues, unmatched expectations. It would actually give them the fodder that they need. And in many ways, again, if you are developing a counter-Islamic Republic policy, you know, it's good to have a Hippocratic Oath kind of approach to this, which is first, do no harm. Don't do something that empowers your adversary. And in this case, yes, the regime, of course, would worry about separatism. And of course, it has a heavy-handed, disgusting approach to many of these provinces. I remember, I think, it was early in the Ahmadinejad government when Ahmadinejad went to Balochistan, and even Ahmadinejad, someone, you know, a polyester-clad Holocaust denier, he cried. And I remember, I forgot what the headline was. I don't know if it was Farsi or somewhere else, but it was like Ahmadinejad gerist, like Ahmadinejad cried at the situation in Balochistan. But his government and his policies perpetuated suffering of the people there. Not only would some of these policies actually end up perpetuating that suffering, but they would perpetuate the power of the people who could continue that kind of suffering. So this is number one. It could actually empower the regime in a perverse way. And number two,
want to, before you go to number two, I want to add something. Khomeini actually said that. He said, Jang yek ne'emat bud, the war was a God sent gift. And there is a reason that after 2 years, he actually continued it. There is a, you know, there is an idea that he was crazy or didn't understand what happened. But I think one of the reasons that they decided we want to continue this war was that because they used it to get rid of everyone. Without the war, they couldn't do that. It would be very difficult. It wouldn't be that easy for them because they weren't that popular after like 1 year. Many people understood what was happening. But then you had the war, and you had like all these movements on the border, and they used it to consolidate the power. And I'm very worried that there are some people who are pushing for this right now on the northwest border, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Iran. I think a conflict there, a military conflict there, would be very bad definitely for an Iran policy whose goal is to the collapse of the Islamist regime in Iran. I think if you have some kind of military conflict there, it would really benefit the regime.
Yeah, I mean, I would just draw a little bit of a separation between Turkey and Azerbaijan and even de facto Israel being able to put pressure on Iran through the Caucasus versus some kind of plot to separate Iran and Azerbaijan, because I'm all for solidifying the impression in the minds of the regime that it is encircled. I think just recently Khamenei said something about
I'm not talking about encircling it, but I think so let me put it this way. Whenever you have a war with the Islamist regime, that it won't topple it, like the Iran-Iraq war, it actually helps it, because the regime always is dealing with this legitimacy crisis. And whenever you have this nationalistic war, the regime finds a space to save itself for a few years, for a decade, something like that.
Can I just add one brief thing? That notion of what Saeed's talking about, rally around the flag, when it comes to Iran policy, I think is very often used, but very often incorrectly. But in this case, it's exactly right. I think Behnam will see what you say. That's what we saw with Saddam's invasion of Iran. The actual opposition to the regime could do very little at that time when its country was invaded, not by a liberating force, but by an invading force that was not trying to topple the regime, but that was against not only the Islamic Republic, against the country of Iran. The real opposition to the regime could do very little when its country is being invaded. Similarly, if there were to be a war pushed by foreign powers to take advantage of the country, that the rally around the flag effect would likely be very real. I mean, it's not like the rally around the flag effect that people talk about with sanctions, when Iranians respond in the streets, our enemy is right here. They lie when they say it's America. If there were a force that were looking to invade the country and, not to topple the regime, but simply to take advantage of Iran's weak state, people would, in all likelihood, actually rally around the flag and be forced to rally to the current force maintaining Iran's territorial integrity.
And I think actually this is just my analysis, I don't have any information, but I think the Revolutionary Guards actually tried to make this recent conflict with Azerbaijan, push it towards some kind of military conflict. And because the posture was very strange, in terms of what actually happened, it wasn't a big crisis, but the guard really was pushing it at some point. And I think the guard actually doesn't mind a limited military conflict with a lesser force in terms of consolidating more power and benefiting from the nationalist sentiment. Because the guard right now, the opinion about the guard is very low. So if the Revolutionary Guard can, portray itself as the guardian of the country against an invading force, that really benefits the guard too.
Yeah, this is you get to the transposition of what the guards are actually guarding. Let's remember that the title, IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They are not, in the purest sense, guarding the nation. They are intentionally guarding an idea that is housed in the elites of this government, of the Islamic Republic. They are guarding that with their lives and by causing death. Iran does like, the Islamic Republic does like these limited conflicts. Just a few months ago, a month and a half ago, September, there was a rocket barrage at a Kurdistan opposition group in northern Iraq. They did the same thing in July 2019, if I'm not mistaken, and then also in 2018, in September, October 2018. September, October 2018, they used ballistic missiles. July 2019, rockets, conventional artillery. September 2021, rockets, conventional artillery. They actually like this sort of stuff because they're actively trying to co-opt a force that exists. And this goes back to the nationalism thing and do no harm. What an overt policy of support for, potential separatism, potential secession, tear Iran up would do is that it would empower the guards to try to do what they are doing now with these more limited set piece conflicts, which is to shed that label of IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and try to win this Iranian label, try to win this label of guarding the actual country, when in fact their behavior, their policies at home and abroad are the things that Iranians of all stripes actually resent. Their behavior and their policies are the things that have actually impeded Iran, are the things that have actually kept back Iran, are the things that have impeded the growth of the country, are the things that have made life hell for Iranians who actually care about the country inside that country. It would allow them to make that transition, perhaps not a seamless transition, but it would allow them to make that transition. And that is very, very dangerous. And this is my big thing about the protests from 2017 to 2020 is that it's properly understanding civic nationalism. We, as a policy community in Washington, we haven't done that. But also it's understanding that this is a malleable force and a force that can go in many directions. And the 2017 to 2020 and to 2021 protests are actually an indicator for policymakers to tell you of what a nationalist future of Iran could look like. The people doing the protests are very different. They're actually from rural areas. They're actually in favor of a less interventionist foreign policy. They actually have national icons. They actually tell you about what they would like for the future. They actively tell you what political officials, Rouhani, Khamenei, they shun. I'm so glad, Kamran, you mentioned the rally around the flag, because that's what everybody said after the killing of Soleimani. But that rally lasted only a few days, because then you had Iranians out on the streets again protesting against that downing of the Ukraine airliner with so many innocent lives lost. You had that in Tehran, you had that in the capital. Just recently, again, you want to talk about ethnic conflagration. You had the protests in Khuzestan. Yes, of course, there is an ethno-separatist component there. You can't deny that. But also you can't deny, to borrow a phrase from former President Nixon, this great silent majority that is also increasingly not becoming silent vis-a-vis that separatist elite. And that's why when you had protests in Iran and Azerbaijan, it wasn't they're protesting for separatism, we should protest for separatism. It was in favor of what was going on, because they too have been discriminated against, and their target was not Iran, their target was the government of the Islamic Republic. And this is a very important thing for Western policymakers to take note of. You had Lors and Arabs again in Iran's southwest, in Izeh and Susan Gert. You explained this brilliantly, Kamran, in a video NUFDI put out, coming together. And reading the rise of nationalism inside Iran as ethno-nationalism misses this civic nationalism component entirely, and worse, allows the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to try to move in and co-opt what's left of that civic nationalism. And you would be giving the regime that final prop that they needed. And I remember one of the very vivid attempts when the Guard Corps tried to do this. And this is why I actually trace a lot of nationalist theory, a lot of nationalist history, a lot of nationalist language. There's excellent books we can talk about, Hobsbawm, Benedict Anderson, Yael Tamir. We can talk about all these different scholars who've written brilliantly about nationalism and nationalist theory, and about the importance of people and the importance of shared history, the importance of shared customs, and the importance of territory to nationalism. So with the ISIS attacks in Iran, inside Iranian territory, remember the mausoleum attack of Khomeini, the Iranian response in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, was a ballistic missile barrage at ISIS positions in eastern Syria. Saeed, you probably have seen this in real life in I've only seen pictures. I've never been in Van Eyck Square, you know, the big place where they have this poster, this roundabout in Van Eyck. There's this poster, and the regime likes to put different pro-regime imagery up on that big building where, you know, it's kind of like a rounded, she can't got it, but
it's like Times Square. Billboards.
It has this roundabout to it, and so there's a lot of imagery, a lot of pro-regime imagery, often on that rounded building in this part of Tehran. And I remember the one after the missile operation was an attempt by the Guard Corps to do exactly what I'm saying. And it was a hand you couldn't see the head, but it was a body in an IRGC uniform, and it was a hand, and each finger was launching ballistic missiles. And you had the guy had the IRGC logo, and it just had up in Persian on the top, Ma Modafe Iran Hastim. We are Iran's guardian. No, your behavior is not the guardian of Iran. Your behavior is the guardian of this Islamist autocracy. But that is a move to take advantage of attacks on the territory, again, the primacy of territory in nationalist theory, to try to shed that label and to try to take advantage of this brief lull, this brief period, and move into this space, which is the co-opt the civic nationalism when you can space at every time a crisis presents itself. So again, as a policymaker, think of this issue.
Behnam, you've been very generous with us with your time, and I know you have places to be. I want to just tackle one last issue if I can, and it's related to this. But we've talked about the issue of supporting separatism and secessionism and how it's regressive, it's out of touch with history and the contemporary context, and really makes no sense. It's just being supported by some separatist elites, and you're perhaps too polite to say it, but I'll say it. Some of the people in the West who are supporting it are lobbyists of some of these countries, but that's a different issue for a different time. What I want to talk about is we've mentioned how this could, in fact, cement the authority and the longevity of the Islamic Republic. Let's say, and I think that's likely, let's say that doesn't happen. Let's say we're wrong, and one of the other possible outcomes is that this actually does cause the collapse of the regime, that whether it's because of U.S. support of secessionism or separatism or others, or these groups are effective, and one way the regime falls, and these groups gain the upper hand. And in Khuzestan or Baluchistan or Kurdistan, we start to see breakaway provinces, statelets, as you referred to them. Something that strikes me, and Saeed and I have spoken about this, and he mentioned it earlier. I don't think it's very likely that if that were to be the case, that what would remain of Iran at that point, the nationalist forces, if you will, the center of the country, and even broad swaths of the population inside those breakaway renegade provinces or new statelets would be okay with that. They won't simply accept that status quo, in my view. And that would lead to a significant conflict in the region. This is the civil war that Saeed's talking about. But I want you to assess it for us, if you will, from a U.S. policy perspective, and even to an extent from a regional policy perspective. Wouldn't that, especially if, let's say, you have some Arab countries supporting Arab separatist groups, or you have some other, the Azerbaijanis or others supporting separatists in the northern part of the country, or in Balochistan, doesn't that, for America, who's sort of on the left and the right on this trend of getting out of conflicts in the Middle East, doesn't that bode a serious threat of forcing America or other Western countries, certainly regional countries, not only to deal with a huge refugee crisis that would overtake Europe, or you have some other dwarf Azerbaijanis or others supporting separatists in the northern part of the country, or really having a serious conflict, doesn't that, in the region, for America, who's sort of on the left and the right on this trend of getting out of conflicts in the Middle East, doesn't that bode a serious threat of forcing America or other Western countries, certainly regional countries, not only to deal with a huge refugee crisis that would overtake Europe and likely dwarf whatever we've just seen in Syria? Doesn't it pose the threat of really having a serious conflict in the region into which Western forces, the US and regional forces, would be forced to play a role and be really sucked into?
For sure. And this is, again, for US policymakers, US strategists, the lesson of the Middle East in the past 2 decades is it can always get worse. you think you've hit rock bottom, it can always get worse. Another lesson is be able to anticipate the most likely and least likely moves of your adversary. And before you go with plan A, come up with plan C, D, E, F to counteract your adversary's most likely and most effective plan B. Having steps 1 and 3 thought out. So when step 2 happens, you're not caught with your pants down. And in this instance, Iran has an incentive, or what would be left of the government of the Islamic Republic in one of these instances where 1 or 2 or 3 or many or only 1 or any number of statelets would be created with such a policy, with limited foreign backing, select foreign backing, however you want to have it, is that remainder government would have every incentive to go start a war and retake that territory. And in this sense, they would have an impression of, let's hypothetically say it's an American-backed statelet that is created. They would have an impression of American resolve. And that impression is, well, in, what was it, 2017 or 2018 with the referendum of the KRG. The US did not back that. What happened after the referendum? Pro-Iran Shia militias, I believe Qasem Soleimani was there and alive at the time, moved to crush. They moved to kill innocents. And so in that sense, Uncle Sam was missing in action. Now, obviously, the U.S. did not, push for the referendum. That's something within northern Iraq, within Iraqi Kurdistan's domestic politics. But nonetheless, in an attempt by the local actor to force the hand of the patron to get more support, the patron bugged out and ended up not supporting. You saw a similar thing with the Kurds in Syria under former President Trump, for instance. And in this sense, you would end up vindicating the worst of the worst actors inside Iran, people like former commander of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, who in 2010 said to an Iraqi official, and it was reported publicly in English in 2013, this line about America. And Washington should always think about this line when it's looking at this Middle Eastern partnerships, alliances, and try hard not to prove this line correct. And the line is, we're not like the Americans, we don't abandon our friends. You don't want to be in the business of ex post proving Qasem Soleimani right. So to prove him wrong, you would draw US forces into the region to support this new state that would be created hypothetically. This is not a Kuwait situation where there's a state that exists and actually has some kind of financial relationship with Iraq, and the Iraqis didn't pay back the loans from the Iran-Iraq war, and the Iraqis manufacture some crisis, and Washington waffles, and ultimately Iraq invades, and the US has to get a coalition to kick Iraq out. This would be the converse of that, because there is no Kuwait version that exists yet. Why? Because we talked about in the beginning of this podcast that Iran is smaller today than has existed in the past. It's not like it's irredentively gone something under an irredentist nationalist cause and conquered territory, and you are trying to evict them from that territory. There is this history that comes with different people living in the same spaces, and you can't ignore that history. And that history is going to be bearing down on you in steps 2, 3, and 4 of any scenario of support for secession or separatism inside Iran. And not also again would it be ignorant of the Kashmir and the Yugoslavia examples. It would be in that sense it would be a lose-lose. If how could you generate support for some kind of intervention when there is significant support on the left and right for less active intervention there. I would be curious to see how a U.S. policymaker would do that. And in the hypothetical instance that the support for that statelet would not come from a major foreign player like America and the West, but from a much more smaller, localized regional actor, hypothetically Azerbaijan, Iran might do what it just did recently, which is begin to bare its teeth. The major military drill Saeed was talking about, what happened after that major military drill? Azerbaijan released the 2 truckers that it had jailed. In essence, the regime's baring of teeth worked because the regime is counting whatever is left of it on forcing accommodation by smaller, less capable powers. And that's exactly what you see happening right now with Saudi-Iranian diplomacy. Why are the Saudis doing bilateral direct diplomacy with the Islamic Republic? Because the Islamic Republic has erected a conflict in Yemen right next door to them. And the Saudis feel that US support has been waffling. And in 2019, we had a front row seat to how the U.S. did not end up standing up to something that's called the Carter Doctrine, when the Iranians had attacked tankers, then shot down U.S. drones, and ultimately attacked oil installations. There was no kinetic response by Washington to any of this. And this is things that are Washington's interests. So why would regional states think that Washington would have its back when Washington didn't necessarily do the things that were in its own interest? So Iran is going to go again and try to resurrect that Soleimani line with these other states to say, accommodate me, accommodate the Islamic Republic, accommodate the regime's foreign and security policy, and you'll be safer. And that is a very dangerous position to be in, particularly as America is having a diminishing military footprint in the region.
I think U.S. policy regarding the collapse of the regime should be that you have the collapse of the regime and you have a government in place which is friendly to the United States and which has a less expansionary regional policy, can live with its neighbors. And if U.S. goes for that secession policy, if the regime falls, it's not going to happen. So if the U.S. pushes the secession, the regime falls, the next government will not be pro-U.S. And I think that would be the biggest loss. And in the scenario that Cameron and you described, which of these, I don't think U.S. goes in, as you said. I think it's very difficult to forecast the situation that U.S. goes into, I don't know, to support the Khuzestan state, which doesn't exist. I don't see many regional powers who have this interest to do that. Like for the Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf, so you have the Khuzestan, which is a mixed population of Arabs and other ethnicities, but these Arabs are Shia. So why would you how can you do that? The most likeliest supporter would be Iraq, which itself is really a failed state. Same with Kurdistan. The only place that I see something is in Azerbaijan. In other places, I really don't see any regional backer who want to do that. In Balochistan, the Pakistanis have problem with their Balochs. I don't think they have any interest to tell the Iranian Baloch to come and become part of Pakistan, Balochistan. So it's I really don't see many regional powers whose interest in a situation that the regime has collapsed is to support these mini states. I think the interest is to have a government in Iran, which is part of the general Western alliance and can work with its neighbors.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think we have a whole Behnam already offered us his services to come back for part 2 at some point, and we have to talk about his ideal.
Last thing that came to mind. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Please go ahead.
Shikar Muni Kalamet, as we say, is the major orienting foreign and security policy challenge of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to the U.S. now is the nuclear program, and has really been for the past few decades, but particularly in 2002 with the revelation of some of these sites and activities. What does this do for the nuclear program? It doesn't do anything. It may even impede counterproliferation policy, depending on what entity, where you're supporting. Okay, some of the missile bases are much more spread out. Okay, military bases are much more spread out. But I don't necessarily see how this fits into larger U.S. foreign and security policy. Again, if you are thinking of low-cost ways to turn the screws on the Islamic Republic, this would seem to be counterproductive, and it would be counterproductive towards the one long pole of unifying bipartisan interest towards a pressure policy on Iran, which is how to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. This would not at all not solve that. It will put fire on that.
I think that's exactly right. I think we largely agree, but it's always a pleasure to be educated by Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Saeed, thanks for spending your Saturday with us. Behnam, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. I personally learned so much, and I was really glad to get to listen to the both of you today. And I think Saeed will be on the same page as me when I say we're going to have to take you up on your offer to bring you back for another episode to talk about what should ideal U.S. policy be now that we've described what a nightmare supporting secessionism and separatism would be, both for Iran, the region, and for the U.S.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. It was I, too, who learned immensely from you, Kamran, and from you, Saeed. And again, I hope to continue the conversation. Iran will be in the headlines, and it will be on many's hearts and many's minds.
And when Iran is back in the headlines, as always, you can listen to and read what Behnam has to say, probably in whatever the most impressive international outlet is next time. So Behnam, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Behnam. Have a good day.
Thank you.